All right. Looks like we are live here on Standing for Truth, and we are in the Debate Dojo. This is late night in the Debate Dojo, specifically with Jackson Rowe, my good friend. We have had, there you go, Jackson, just as pumped as I am. And so Jackson and I, we've had numerous debates and discussions over the last couple years. Jackson, you've been putting out quite a few videos on the topic of genetic entropy.
Yeah.
And so I thought, you know what? Let's come together tonight and have more of an informal debate, more so a discussion on the topic of genetic entropy. And from there, we might end up digging into some related topics. And so we'll just call this creation versus evolution. And so, Jackson, what's going on? How you doing tonight?
Doing good. I was just taking pictures of Saturn and Titan with the telescope I borrowed because I sold mine for some reason. I shouldn't have done that. But yeah, that's what I was doing earlier. I went fossil hunting earlier today, so it's been a busy day of science, I guess.
That's a day of science. You've been telescoping and you were fossil hunting.
Yeah.
So you're preparing for your upcoming creation versus evolution debates and also your astronomy related debates. You've got a geocentrism debate coming up next month.
I'm excited for that.
And then the following month, you'll probably be having we're early in the details, but a flat earth related debate. So Jackson, we're going to keep you busy. So to the audience, yes, this is impromptu. We literally just set this show and we are live. And the reason is because Jackson and I both found some time tonight to engage in a discussion. We were supposed to have this earlier, examining the evidence for human evolution with Dr. Peter Line. Dr. Peter Line was having some connection issues, but we did manage to get them fixed. Now, unfortunately, it was about an hour to an hour and a half after our start time. And so Peter and I talked for another 30 minutes or so and discussed details and format for tomorrow. And so rather than starting late, as we are probably going to be digging into this topic for about 3 hours, we figured it is best to move the show into tomorrow. And so tomorrow, roughly the same time, sometime between 6 and 6:15, we will be live with Peter Line on the same topic, which is examining the evidence for human evolution. Yesterday, we had an excellent show with Helmut Welk on aliens, UFOs, and the Bible. We had a fantastic audience the entire time. It's been getting a lot of positive feedback and views. So if you're interested in the topic of aliens, UFOs, and the Bible, whether you're a skeptic or a non-skeptic, I do highly recommend you check that out. Thursday, we'll be back here for an eschatology related debate. Kirby Tab and Scott Clem, futurism versus historicism. Then on Saturday, we've got the big main event, theology-wise. Kelly Powers and Sean Griffin, is the Trinity biblical? And I believe it's Friday. Let me see here, double check my schedule. We've got a soteriology debate. So a little bit of everything for you guys this week. And as we move into October, I am going to be incorporating a lot more of these impromptu open mics. And I'll be able to do so because from June to September, I packed every single week with about 5 events. For October, it's going to be more so 4 events. And then that way I have a few days each week to engage in open mics or impromptu discussions on different topics: creation, evolution, eschatology, soteriology. So I'm really looking forward to October, as it is going to be a month where we can engage in panel discussions and open mic discussions on a number of important topics. So with that, Jackson, we are going to kick off our event tonight with the topic of genetic entropy. And so, Jackson, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can start off by telling the audience why you are now an advocate of genetic entropy, now that you've converted after all these debates and discussions.
Yeah, well, I
All
looked
jokes
into
aside,
it a little more, and it's totally a thing.
there you go.
I'm just kidding.
We're on the same
That's not-
team now.
Not what I think. But all right, I'll just start out with one point, and we'll just go back and forth. Okay, so the nearly neutral mutations would have to become fixed in the population, wouldn't you say, to become, to really impact the human population? And how long will it take a nearly neutral mutation to become fixed in a population of 8 billion? Just one single mutation. I think
That's a good question. Yeah, those are a couple of good questions. I wouldn't say, and I do have some slides on this issue. I won't get into the slides just yet. But to answer your basic couple questions is, I don't believe that for genetic degeneration to be a challenge and a problem, that the mutations necessarily have to become fixed in the population. They can just drift around, right? Because nearly neutral mutations, by definition, are not subject to selection, as you know. And so selection can't see them. They're invisible. They spread and they lead to genetic sickness and genetic degeneration. And that is a problem for species. But the fact that in an evolutionary time scale, your slightly deleterious mutations that are nearly neutral, they would, many of them, drift to fixation, which means they're stuck in place. And at that site, you have irreversible or irreparable genetic damage. And so that just makes the problem worse. It exacerbates the problem that exists with or without fixation. But I would argue that fixation makes it more of a problem. Jackson, go ahead.
All right. Well, the thing about, nearly neutral mutations, out of the deleterious mutations, about maybe 5, I think I've read, less than 10% are classified as slightly deleterious. So it's an incredibly low number of these mutations that are even considered slightly deleterious that are accumulating. And 95% of the genome is subject to some sort of selection. So when you play that math, I think it doesn't work for any kind of time scale you're talking about.
Okay, so your first point, how many mutations did you read were deleterious? 3?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. Now, 3 deleterious mutations. Why do you believe that is from the evolutionist perspective? Why are they saying only 3 are deleterious?
I don't know.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, they're saying 3 are deleterious in light of a mutation rate that's about 100 per person per generation, correct?
Right, 100 per generation. And right.
So out of those 100, you're saying only 3 are deleterious.
No, what I'm saying is, I think what I'm saying is, out of the 3 deleterious mutations, the deleterious mutations are going to be selected out, obviously, but the nearly neutral deleterious mutations make up only 10% of the deleterious mutations.
Okay, so you're obviously, if a mutation is big enough to kill the organism, there's not going to be any reproduction.
Right.
So there's not going to be any progeny. And so that is another matter altogether, because genetic entropy is about the nearly neutral mutations that accumulate unchecked because selection can't see them. So yes, we would agree that there does exist mutations that are detrimental for selection to see. And selection just has to do with differential reproduction. Who's reproducing the most? And so if a mutation kills somebody before they can have a child, well, then it's no longer nearly neutral because it was subject to selection.
Right.
But you're arguing that the vast majority of mutations are not slightly deleterious.
No,
they're absolutely neutral.
No, I'm not explaining this well. Of these deleterious mutations, only about 10% of them qualify as nearly neutral deleterious. So only about 10% or less are going to accumulate like that.
Okay. Finish your argument and then I'll respond in whole.
All right. Well,
in the
basically, you have to, in my mind, you have to reach fixation with these deleterious mutations or nearly neutral mutations, because if you don't, you have all different ones throughout the population, and maybe some die out, and with it all of that particular type of deleterious mutation, and then you just reach an equilibrium, and it just keeps going like that.
So mutation drift equilibrium.
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. So my follow-up points would be, one, the amount of slightly deleterious mutations that accumulate every generation, aside from the mutations that are big enough for selection to see to kill an organism, that's going to be highly dependent upon how functional the genome is. And so, yes, if you hold to a position, as evolutionists do, that suggests most of the genome is simply neutral junk, then most of those mutations, out of the 100 new mutations per person per generation that accumulate, will be accumulating in neutral regions within the genome. And those neutral regions basically absorb the deleterious effects of those mutations. Because if it's a portion of the genome that's not functional, well, it's going to be a mutation that doesn't really do any damage because there's nothing there to seriously do damage to. And so I would challenge that position that argues most of the genome is non-functional. And we can get into that a little bit, because if the genome is mostly junk and comprises evolutionary leftovers, genomic mistakes, viral infections, right? Ancient infections of exogenous retroviruses. And so we have viral fossils in the genome. Then yes, I think common descent may be the most parsimonious explanation for that. And it may limit the effects of genetic entropy since most of the genome is junk. But if most of the genome is functional, I would argue the genome is probably about 80% functional. Then that means you have 80 slightly deleterious mutations per person per generation, rather than just somewhere between 3 and 10 if you hold to a genome that is only about 3% to 10% functional.
Right, but how are you coming to the conclusion that it's 80% functional?
So you're saying, for sake of argument,
Well, I'll grant it to you. I'm just wondering how you came to that.
Oh, how I came to an 80% function?
Mm-hmm.
Because, and I've got a whole bunch of slides on it, but quickly, I would first look to the 2012 results from the ENCODE project that suggested about 80% of the genome was biochemically active. Now, does biochemical activity equate to function? That's the larger debate question, because you would argue that biochemical function doesn't necessarily equate real function. You would argue that most of that is just noise, or it's spurious transcription, but not really beneficial transcription. And so I think that's where the debate is going to proceed. But before we go to that part, I do want to point out this quote from Douglas Fatuma in this introductory level textbook. Okay. So he says the same number of neutral mutations should be fixed every generation. The rate of fixation of mutations is theoretically constant. And notice this, equals the neutral mutation rate. This is the theoretical basis of the molecular clock. So if evolution is true and evolutionary time scale is true, what does that mean? Well, it means whatever your neutral mutation rate is, that amount of mutations will be fixed every generation. So the nearly neutral mutation rate equals the fixation rate. And so if it's 3 per generation, 3 are being fixed. And that is irreversible and irreparable damage for the evolutionist and for species.
Well, unless you have like compensatory mutations and reversible mutations.
Can you elaborate on that?
Compensatory mutations. I have a slide on that. Hang on. Let's see.
Are you referring to back mutations?
No, no.
I understand that compensatory mutations are different than back mutations, but when it comes to the equilibrium point,
just the ability to mask the deleterious effect of another mutation. And here's something from another paper. Compensatory mutations improve fitness in genotypes that contain deleterious mutations, but have no beneficial effects otherwise. As such, compensatory mutations represent a very specific form of epistasis. There's more, but that's basically it.
Were you looking to share a screen, Jackson, or you just wanted to
no,
read
I'm just reading it. It's just text.
Okay.
There's no reason to share.
Okay.
Yeah.
So compensatory mutations and also back mutations. Okay. Back mutations are incredibly rare. They are happening, but
right, the back mutations are rare, but compensatory mutations seem to be fairly common.
Compensatory mutation would be if a deleterious mutation accumulates, there's also going to be in the short term a mutation that occurs that is beneficial, that essentially compensates for the deleterious effects from the deleterious mutant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're saying every time a deleterious mutation accumulates, let's say the genome is somewhere between 60 to 80% functional, and you have 60 to 80 deleterious mutations accumulating every generation. How many compensatory mutations are occurring to counteract that damage?
I think I have a slide on that too. Let me see. It might be something else, but let me see here. Let's see. A slightly detrimental mutation is somewhat less likely to become fixed by chance than a slightly favorable mutation. That's kind of what I was thinking of. It's not exactly addressing your question, but that's...
Well, because remember, if you have, so for example, if you have the evolutionary time scale, firstly, mutation drift equilibrium is mostly a mathematical idea, okay? Because the truth is, you are going to reach extinction far sooner than you would reach a mutation drift equilibrium or any kind of equilibrium. You basically have enough mutations flipping to where they're returning to the state it was in before that deleterious mutation hit that specific loci, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But
so it's a mathematical model. It's an idea. But if these deleterious mutations are accumulating and they are degenerating organisms over time, then you're going to have extinction far before you reach a point of equilibrium.
Well, even in there was a study on bulb mites. They had a bunch of different populations. I forget what the population size, maybe 10 or 20 individuals in each population. Some went through sexual selection, some didn't. The ones that went through sexual selection, they were all highly inbred on purpose through the generations. The ones that went through sexual selection were saved from these deleterious mutations. So they were purged from the population through the process of sexual selection. The males or the females would choose the males with that were more fit, so to speak, and they survived. So even a population like that, where these deleterious mutations are becoming fixed, they were able to be purged, starting to become fixed.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple questions based on that, but based on your position overall.
Mm-hmm.
So based on this slide here, Kiteley and Lynch, would you agree that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious?
Yeah.
Okay. So the vast majority of deleterious mutations are deleterious. Would you agree that the vast majority of mutations are too subtle in their effects to be seen by selection?
Not according to everything I've read. Like what I was saying about the percentage of nearly neutral mutations that are slightly deleterious, the slightly deleterious mutations, it's only 10% or less of all mutations.
Okay, but you did just agree that the vast majority of mutations are deleterious.
Sure, to some degree, yeah.
Okay. So if the vast majority of mutations are neutral, then doesn't that mean that the vast majority of neutral mutations are therefore deleterious?
I didn't say they were mostly neutral.
Okay, but so the vast majority of mutations are deleterious, but you saying the vast majority of mutations are also subject to selection?
I would say it's going through some sort of selection, yeah.
In that generation. So for example,
not necessarily in that generation. I mean,
okay, so you're saying eventually they accumulate to a point. So they accumulate to a point where the damage in that population is large enough for selection to now see, because it is now those deleterious mutations that have been accumulating for generations are now affecting fitness.
Well, no, not exactly. If you say if you build up enough mutations on one spot of the genome, let's just say, eventually the ones that have all the individuals that have that particular set of fixed mutations in a population, maybe they will not fix, but maybe polymorphic, will become extinct, but not the whole population.
But remember, population wide, so take human beings, you have 7 to 8 billion human beings on the planet. Every single person who is reproducing is passing on 100 new mutations roughly per person per generation. Okay, so you have that offspring having 50 mutations from mom, 50 mutations from dad, but this is happening every generation population wide. And so this generation alone, if you have 7 to 8 billion people, 100 new mutations per person per generation, that's 700 to 800 billion new mutations per person per generation. So my point is the entire population is mutant. Everybody is multiply mutant. And yes, there's variation in the mutations, there's variation in fitness, but overall, your trend is downward in light of these mutations. Go ahead.
All right, a couple of things. The whole population doesn't have they have the same mutation rate, but not the same mutations. That's a key point.
Right.
Also, at what point, what was the second point I was going to make? The 8 billion people. So at what point, why is the population still increasing if fitness is declining?
Well, firstly, I think that's going to depend on our definition of fitness, because mutations can accumulate that are slightly deleterious, but don't actually affect a person's ability to reproduce. For example, you could have inherited, and you did inherit, mutations from your parents that were slightly deleterious, but that doesn't prevent you from reproducing, having kids, and therefore passing on a mutational load to your kids, because none of those mutations were big enough to prevent reproduction, right? So in terms of total functionality, I would argue that total functionality has decreased, but in respect to reproductive fitness, it's essentially neutral because you were still able to have kids. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but here's another thing. At what point does the extinction occur? I mean, not every individual is going to die at the same time. Would you agree?
Right.
Or be able to not reproduce.
It's not like the population of human beings, the human being population is going to reach a point where suddenly in one generation, everybody is wiped out due to deleterious mutation accumulation.
Sure, but your prediction is, you ever seen the movie Children of Men?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So your prediction would be something like, eventually there's going to be a steep decline in fertility, and no one's going to be having children anymore. It's going to be a dystopian future, maybe way off in the future, but something like that scenario. maybe.
We should ask Clive Owen, see what he thinks. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
So a good movie.
it is good.
I'll help illustrate my point with, if I can find a specific citation here. So your mutations will, so for example, here with Michael Lynch, an average newborn contains 100 de novo mutations, right? So you're going to argue most of those are not having enough of an effect. That, well, I guess your position is kind of confusing because you're agreeing that most mutations are slightly deleterious, or deleterious, as the other citation said. But at the same time, it's not an issue. If you could, I want to understand your position a little better. So if you could elaborate on that. So 100 de novo mutations per person per generation, and the majority of those are deleterious. But at the same time, from your position, why is it not an issue? It's start with that.
All right. Well, deleterious, I think a lot of times, like beneficial is kind of a relative term. I mean, you know what I mean by that?
So you're saying deleterious is a relative term?
I mean, dependent on the environment, really.
Okay. So if it only
like
has...
there are certain things that are definitely deleterious, like, okay, cancer, there's no environment where that's helpful.
Right. Single rust molecules on a car, as they accumulate over time, we would both agree that those are deleterious. But a single rust molecule on its own is inconsequential to the overall health of the car. But eventually that car accumulates so many rust spots that the car is no longer usable. It needs to be junked, it needs to be trashed, and you have to get a new car. Well, that's how it is with these slightly deleterious mutations that accumulate. To answer your question, is they can accumulate in a population for a while unchecked. And although that population is degenerating slowly due to the accumulating genetic load, it's not until it reaches a point where the genetic load is so high that reproduction is affected negatively, where now the offspring per person is significantly lower than what it was. And so basically a population can stay stable for a while. If you think of a graph, a population can stay stable for a while. Think of a long horizontal line. But eventually so many effectively neutral mutations have accumulated where you get to a point where now that horizontal line goes down, and down rather quickly, because now the load is so large that it is affecting reproduction in the same way that a car can function for a long time, but eventually it reaches a point where it's been affected negatively for so long that the car starts going downhill rather quickly. You got to take it to the shop more frequently. It's all rusting out. It's falling apart. It's not usable. Does that kind of make sense? Does that illustration help?
This kind of mutational meltdown has only really ever been observed in things with incredibly small populations, not humans with 8 billion or something like that.
It takes longer with larger populations, right? Like we've seen it in mammoths. They had a high genetic load. We've seen it in a lot of your hominins, like Neanderthals, Hobbit, Luzonensis. Neanderthal, we understand that they were highly inbred. So a lot of those recessive deleterious mutations, they came to the forefront and they led to rapid genetic degeneration of that species. They were 40% less fit. So what I like to say is what we see in small, highly inbred populations is a sneak preview into where we are going genetically as a species, because we're a larger population. So it's going to take longer to get to that point. Go ahead.
Okay. So we started from Adam and Eve, but then we really started again with Noah's 3 sons and their wives. So I believe you think, I know you think that Neanderthals are humans. So from 3 pairs, this one group became so inbred, but somehow the rest of them didn't. In what model does that make sense?
Well, that's because in any growing population, so say you start with Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve start having kids, and then their kids start having kids. Well, what we have is rapid and exponential population growth from Adam and Eve. Then you have your flood bottleneck, where the population is, as you correctly stated, reduced to 8 people. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their 3 wives. And from there, you have those 3 reproducing couples having kids, and then their kids are having kids. And we have, again, a rapidly growing population, rapid and exponential population growth. But within that greater population, let's say that parent population, you could have many daughter populations, because small groups of people, maybe even just a small family, branches off from the greater population, and they migrate to an undesirable area on the globe, okay, like Neanderthals. And then from there, they start reproducing, but they reproduce from a small founding population, but that population stays small. And so what happens is inbreeding, founder effects, fixation events, and eventually genetic meltdown. But meanwhile, your main population is still growing. And then at the Tower of Babel, you have many different groups split off, but some groups do make it to an isolated area on the globe, but they experience rapid and exponential population growth. So they don't continue as a small, highly inbred population. Okay.
But it sounds like you're kind of refuting your own point by saying it relies on small static populations.
Well, when it comes, go ahead, take your time.
Well, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it depends on, like in the case of Neanderthals, they remained as a small population, right? They only existed as 10,000 individuals, if that, and they never grew into the hundreds of thousands to millions. And so that small population,
here's the thing about
let me just say this, that small population being highly inbred, they're going to degenerate a lot faster than the population as a whole that comprises 7 to 8 billion people. But eventually, so many mutations are going to accumulate that progeny are going to inherit identical letters, right? This goes back to alleles and basic genetics, where you've got capital A, lowercase a, capital B, lowercase b. You're genetically heterozygous at that position. But as more and more deleterious mutations accumulate over time, offspring at very many sites are going to be capital A, capital A, capital B, capital B. And so they're going to be genetically homozygous, and that's not good. And that's when your genetic meltdown starts taking an even faster effect downhill, basically.
All right. Well, with Neanderthals, we technically, they didn't go extinct completely. They did, but it's a technical. They were kind of subsumed into Homo sapiens. You know that we're humans are up to 3% Neanderthal in our DNA. Do you accept that, or is that something you would have a problem accepting?
Yes, there was interbreeding with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, because when your Homo sapiens group met up with Neanderthals outside of Africa, according to the out of Africa model, they interbred and intermarried with the Neanderthal. And so they produce offspring. And therefore, we now have their genetics. About 3% of our genetics are Neanderthal. So we either assimilated or they went extinct due to inbreeding and genetic meltdown, or conquest, war, conquest, inbreeding, assimilation, probably a little bit of everything, right?
Yeah. So here's the thing about the interbreeding part. That kind of defeats the thing about the founding effect of the population, because that would mean you'd have new genetic information coming in all the time. So that would mean they didn't go extinct from inbreeding or genetic entropy at all.
Well, you have a larger population of Homo sapiens that are not genetically inbred or degenerate, and they meet up with Neanderthals as they migrate. But that Neanderthal population would have been, especially the end stage Neanderthal, they were one of the, if not the most inbred people group on the planet. And so they had entire stretches of DNA that comprise identical letters within the genome. And so Homo sapiens meet up with Neanderthal tribes. They're capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. So yes, Neanderthal in many ways live on through us, but it doesn't change the fact that this was still a highly degenerate people group that was incredibly inbred. I mean, we have their gene.
Yeah, they were inbred, but
Right.
that doesn't mean they went extinct because of that.
Well, luckily, it sounds like Homo sapiens. Now, I would argue that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are both Homo sapiens, both humans, basically. Okay. And Homo sapiens, for lack of a better term, they migrate to where the Neanderthals are. They interbreed, intermarry, right? But if that wouldn't have happened, then what would have happened to the Neanderthals? Probably something similar to mammoth. Mammoth, I have one paper that talks about how they carried a very high genetic load and probably went extinct due to that genetic load. I've even got papers that says Neanderthals probably went extinct due to high genetic load. But yes, because of the interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, their genetics does live on in us today. But where's Neanderthals now? They don't exist. They're gone. So It's not like we assimilated into them and now it's only Neanderthals with Homo sapien DNA. It's the other way around. It's Homo sapiens, modern human beings, with 3% Neanderthal DNA. Go ahead, speak to that.
All right. Well, I'll go back to the point about an influx of new genetic diversity from that. They did the same thing with Florida panthers and like mountain lions out west. They brought in several of them to supplement the inbred population of Florida panthers to create more genetic diversity. And Florida panthers didn't go extinct. I think their population is currently increasing. I'm not 100% sure, but they're not going extinct as of right now.
Okay, so to discuss this specific point, there's a Florida panther.
Wait, one more thing. But if, say, a bunch of hunters suddenly decided to start hunting the Florida panthers, then they would start going extinct, and it might appear down the line, 1,000 years from now, they sequenced the DNA. They said, "Hey, these are really inbred," but the actual reason for their extinction was, they were hunted. So this could have been a similar scenario with Neanderthal. They were outcompeted, they were hunted, something like that.
It's also very similar to what we see with the cheetahs today. So the cheetahs exist now in a population of about 7,000 highly inbred individuals. Just years ago, they were 10,000. I've checked recently, they're down to 7,000. And so conservationists are incredibly worried about the health of the cheetah. Their sperm's degenerate. They've got stretches of DNA that are identical in letters. So they're very homozygous. Okay. Now we're not going to expect that population of 7,000 cheetahs to suddenly start exploding into all parts of the globe or begin experiencing rapid and exponential population growth, where they go from that highly degenerate state to a state that they may have existed in genetically thousands of years prior to the state that they're in. Like, I don't think they're going to get any better. Like, it sounds like they're going downhill and they're going to continue going downhill. But let's say, using your example, let's say hunters moved in and started killing off all the cheetahs, God forbid. Well, then the cheetahs are going to go extinct quicker because now man is intervening. If we just leave them the way they are, then they'll just slowly decline more and more and more. They're not going to get any better, is my point. Go ahead.
Well, I was saying about the mountain lions. They brought in another population of mountain lions to supplement the genetics.
Okay.
And maybe they didn't go extinct, but if they did go extinct, it would be because of something like hunting. If hunting's not really a problem in Florida for the Florida panther, but if it was, that would be an example. Down, thousands of years from now, they would sequence the DNA of the Florida panther, and they would say, oh, these must have gone extinct from inbreeding, but actually they went extinct from hunting. That was my example.
So there's a subpopulation of panther
that
has degenerated genetically.
The Florida panther, yeah.
Yeah. And they brought in a different panther to assimilate and add healthy genetic variability to that population.
Right.
Okay. So which subgroup of cheetahs are they going to bring in to supplement the degenerate genetics of the 7,000 cheetahs with better genetics?
That's my other thing. That's one scenario you can save them with. But the paper about bulb mites I was reading, they were talking about actually just kind of letting them go and do their own thing, and the females will select healthier males, and they can be, the deleterious mutations can be purged that way. That were the implications from that paper about the sexual selection with the bulb mites.
But if evolution is true, deep time evolution, the evolutionary time scale, and therefore your nearly neutral mutation rate equals the fixation rate. And so say you have a population of 1 million and the nearly neutral mutation rate is 50 per generation, then 50 letters within the genome are going to be substituted for every single generation. And so that's irreversible, irreparable damage. And so how are you ever going to be able to alter that, even through compensatory mutations? Because there's too many deleterious mutations that are basically reaching fixation.
Well, there are more compensatory mutations then. I mean, it could just keep going on like this. But let me give another example. Viroids, these plant viruses, they have an incredibly small genome and a really, really high mutation rate. And they've been around for, let's say, on your time scale, like, let's say 4,000 years. Why have they not gone extinct yet? And they're not even subject to recombination like we are. So really, genetic entropy should be taking an effect faster on viroids.
Okay, so, well, when it comes to viroids and viruses and bacteria, they behave a lot differently than, am I coming in okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. They behave a little differently than higher mammals and more complex organisms, because as you already know, Paul Price went over this, genetic entropy applies most to higher organisms like elephants, like human beings, like whales. When it comes to bacteria and other simple organisms or viroids, we don't necessarily predict extinction or strong genetic entropy like we would predict in humans and elephants, let's say, higher mammals. So your viroid example, that's an interesting one, but that would still fall within the lines of, again, viruses, bacteria. But I would actually point to...
But why are we drawing this line?
Well, because genetic entropy was written for, so for example, here on the slide, if you can see it, genetic entropy applies most to humans and elephants. Bacteria have massive population sizes with a large turnover. Mutation rate in bacteria is less than 1 mutation per generation for bacteria. Selection is more efficient in bacteria, but this is not true for human beings. But I would still argue that when we look to long-term bacterial experiments, like in Lenski's experiment, what we actually find is strong evidence for reductive evolution, which I would argue is a form of genomic decay, because these bacterial species, they've shrunk in functional genome sizes. They've accumulated a lot of deleterious mutations. They've thrown out a lot of pre-existing genes and pre-existing systems. They've backed themselves up into a corner. And so that experiment has demonstrated at least one form of genetic entropy through reductive evolution. Go ahead, respond.
Now leave the slide up so I remember this.
Yeah. Go
There's one mutation per generation for, like, say, a virus with a 100,000 base pair genome, and compare it to the 3-something billion base pair of humans. That's still a way higher mutation rate than ours by the ratio.
Do you believe that viruses are living organisms?
It's debatable, but they're definitely made of genetic material.
Right. So you have viruses and you have bacteria, where some viruses appear to be subject to the effects of genetic entropy, like the H1N1 virus that was published by Carter and Sanford. And I know that's an entire debate in and of itself. And in the case that I just described, Lenski's E. coli bacteria, generations after generations, and they've shrunk in functional genome size in light of their environment. And so that is a form of genomic decay. So even in organisms that genetic entropy wouldn't necessarily predict are going downhill in the same way as elephants and humans and higher mammals, we still find many lines of evidence for genomic decay in those organisms. And I would focus specifically on bacteria.
Are Lenski's E. coli experiencing a decline in population?
Well, the population as a whole is experiencing a loss of functionality, a loss of functional genes. And so I would predict over time, the population itself would probably start to decline. But remember, bacteria have incredibly fast reproductive rates. I mean, they reproduce every 15 minutes?
Something like that.
Through fission. Like, imagine we could just duplicate ourselves every 15 minutes. I mean, just to keep the population stable, you'd have to have selection removing millions to billions of individuals in a short amount of time. Because if you have bacteria that are reproducing every 15 minutes and you have trillions of bacteria on the planet, I mean, your gut alone has trillions of bacteria. Viruses, same thing. There's a ton of viruses on the planet. Viruses can also hide in dormancy. They can be dormant for a while, and then after 1,000 or so years, they can come about unchanged. So it's apples and oranges. I know you may disagree with that, but I think it still ignores the bigger picture that we've got a nearly neutral mutation rate. Notice this. If the effectively neutral mutation rate is 50 per person per generation, then that means 50 nearly neutral mutations will become fixed every generation. Okay, so if evolution is true, 50 deleterious mutations becoming fixed every generation, how in the world is your main argument tonight compensatory mutations? You're going to need thousands of compensatory mutations to counterbalance this damage.
50 nearly neutral mutations become fixed every generation, like fixed in the whole population of 8 billion.
Well, I wrote this myself, and this is based on the logic that, and here's the Fatuma quote, that the same number of, so basically, since on average it'll take 4 NE generations for such mutations to reach fixation, how long it takes for slightly deleterious mutations or nearly neutral mutations to reach fixation, about the same number of neutral mutations should be fixed every generation. The rate of fixation mutations is theoretically constant and equals the neutral mutation rate. So hypothetically, if 50 mutations are effectively neutral or nearly neutral per generation, according to evolution, because you have the deep timescales, right? That means every generation, 50 nearly neutral mutations are becoming fixed. And so every time these nearly neutral mutations become stuck in place, that's irreversible and irreparable damage. There's nothing you can do at that point because it's there. And
Well, I
so
think by fixed, you're saying all the mutations are the same throughout the population.
right at that specific genetic loci where the substitution happened, everybody in the population is going to have that same letter,
Right,
that same mutation.
But okay, 8 billion people reproduce. That's not going to happen.
No, according to, see, right now, fixation is very slow because we have 8 billion people on the planet. According to the young Earth creation model, no mutations are really becoming fixed. Maybe after the flood, you've got 8 people, and then you got about 500 years before people start spreading out to all parts of the globe at the Tower of Babel. And so you might have rapid fixation there. But once people start spreading out to all parts of the globe, you can have localized fixation where you have a specific group over here. That's why we have geographically specific Y chromosomes, right? African Y chromosomes, Chinese Y chromosomes, European Y chromosomes, because isolated groups start accumulating their own unique mutations. Okay, but the evolutionary time scale, as you've said, you have a mutation drift equilibrium. And so if evolution is true, this is what Fatuma said. I know it sounds counterintuitive. It's kind of flabbergasting, but just read this. What's he saying? And then interpret this. This is Fatuma. This is from an introductory level textbook, evolution. What does he say here on the slide? Read it out if you could.
Read it out loud or just to myself?
How about the underline part? Read that out loud.
Okay. The same number of neutral mutations should be fixed every generation. The rate of fixation of mutations is theoretically constant and equals the neutral mutation rate.
Right.
It says that, but I don't see how that makes any sense.
Well, yeah, it's it's counterintuitive. It's kind of flabbergasting, but this is this is your own side. This is Douglas Fatuma. This is, basic population genetics. That if evolution is true, right here, standard population genetics theory teaches that the rate of fixation of neutral mutations in a population equals the neutral mutation rate. So if the neutral mutation rate is 50, then 50 are becoming fixed every generation. And then the time bomb, this ticking time bomb, will eventually go off once a sufficient amount of the functional genome has been mutated due to these very slightly deleterious mutations reaching that point of fixation. The young Earth creation model, we don't have that problem. We don't have enough time to reach an equilibrium. We don't have enough time for the neutral mutation rate to equal the fixation rate. And so that's why I believe your argument about compensatory mutations doesn't work, because it's kind of like this, and then speak as long as you want. An illustration came to mind for the audience, as this can be kind of technical. Say you're in a small boat, like a canoe, and you're in the middle of the ocean, and there's a large hole in the boat, and it's sinking. You're slowly sinking. A bunch of water is just coming through, and you're sinking faster and faster. Okay. And all you have is just a small little bucket. And as the water is pouring in, you're using that bucket to throw a little bit of water out here and there, right? Well, it's never going to counterbalance the amount of water that's actually coming in. It's hopeless. Eventually, your boat's going to sink and you're going to drown. And that's how it is when it comes to compensatory mutations, when it comes to beneficial mutations, when it comes to selection. All of these things are like trying to fix your car with a hammer by smashing the car with the hammer every single generation. And so all it ever does is slows down the process, but it never actually stops the process. And as a matter of fact, what we see, like in Lenski's experiment, we see shrinking functional genome sizes, because here's the last thing I'll say. As you're waiting for these desirable mutations to accumulate to counterbalance the damage, Jackson, as you're waiting for a single spot in the genome to experience a beneficial mutation, millions of other nucleotide sites in the genome are being hit with deleterious mutations, that there's no real trade-off. There's no real counterbalance, is basically my point. Go ahead. Feel free to respond.
All right. Well, if Lenski's E. coli go extinct in the next however long, I mean, no one can tell me how long it takes, then I'll concede the point. Maybe genetic entropy, at least in that instance anyway, is definitely a thing. But you said something about Noah and the population of that.
Well, I should say this to clarify. I don't believe Lenski's E. coli bacteria are going to go extinct.
Okay.
Genomes and species can be on the decline genetically, but not necessarily have to go extinct. And
right. So,
a population can. Okay, go ahead.
So why do humans have to go extinct then?
Well, I don't believe humans will go extinct, and certainly won't go extinct anytime soon. But if the evolutionary model is true, and humans have been evolving from pre-human ancestors for millions of years, from Australopithecine-like ancestors up to Homo habilis, up to Homo erectus, who apparently lived on the globe for 1 million plus years, and then eventually Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens sapiens. Well, that is millions of years of these deleterious mutations accumulating, and millions of years of these nearly neutral mutations reaching fixation. So that is a major challenge. But for the young Earth creation model, I mean, we've only got 4,500 years since the flood. You can triple that, 4, 8, 12, roughly, 13 to 14,000 more years. And it's still not nearly the problem that the evolutionary timescale has.
I don't see how, because you started with, I mean, assuming Noah and his wife didn't produce any more children, you have 3 pairs. If you start with 3 pairs of anything in like a conservation setting, I know about this pretty well, you're going to have a population that's pretty screwed up. And you're making the problem worse because you're saying 500 or so years after the flood, they're kind of hanging out in that area, or the Babel, whatever. And then they make the problem worse by splitting up into small populations. So this is just, this model isn't making sense to me.
Well, a couple points, but I still want to get to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the variation in negative effects from these mutations. Okay. So I feel like that was a sticking point on your model, but, and you already know this, the creation and evolution model have 2 very different starting points when it comes to the origin of genetic diversity. You look to, correct me if I'm wrong, the origin of all or nearly all genetic diversity is the result of mutations over time. Mutations add something because they're adding something that was not previously there.
Right.
Okay. The creation model, we start not with genomes of mutations, but we start with genomes with designed alleles, the created heterozygosity hypothesis. And so mutations don't begin to accumulate or even begin to be introduced into the genomes of living organisms until after the fall. And so, sure, Adam and Eve start off as 2, but there's no mutations to come to the forefront to lead to genetic damage. And since it's only a 1-generation bottleneck, it's not going to be an issue, because a 1-generation bottleneck followed by rapid and exponential population growth, firstly, retains most of that original heterozygosity, but 2, there's no mutations to actually result in any serious inbreeding effects. And then the same thing with Noah, roughly 2,000 years later, Noah's family. Go ahead, Jackson.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not starting with Adam and Eve because I know the argument is their genome was perfect or whatever, but I'm saying surely the 3 new founder pairs, their mutation rate was already significant, and surely their offspring would have been even worse, and so on.
I can't remember the exact example, but Matt, I think you and him had a discussion, and he showed an example where they introduced just a couple deer, I think it was, to an island. And from those 2 deer, they got an entire population of deer just from 2. I think that was the example. I'd have to ask Matt if you recall.
I'm not 100% sure about the example. It might have been goats or something.
And so I would argue Noah and his family, they would have had mutations accumulated from the pre-flood world, sure. but not nearly as much as we have today, because they came from a more pristine world, the pre-flood world. And so mutation load is going to increase, I believe, after the flood, especially because of environment and the breakdown of pre-existing DNA repair enzymes. Okay. And so longevity would, as a result, decrease as well. But from those 3 reproducing couples, you still have, again, rapid and exponential population growth. In your sub-tribes that you don't get rapid and exponential population growth, like Neanderthals, Hobbit, Naledi, Luzonensis, Erectus, that's where you get degeneration. That's where you get atypical features, anomalous features. But your larger population that continues on and continues experiencing healthy population growth, they don't degenerate in the same way, nor as quickly as your sub-tribes, your isolated tribes. Okay, I want to ask you this, Jackson.
Right,
I can't believe it's an hour already. This has been fun.
Oh, yeah.
What we can do is break this up into parts, because I'd like to look into your viroids example, okay? To be fair. You bring up some good points for discussion. So, effectively neutral mutations, by definition, do not affect fitness, okay?
Right.
Now, effectively neutral mutations affect fitness, though, when you accurately define fitness. And I would argue that reproductive success is not actually the best definition of fitness, because you can pass on deleterious mutations to your offspring, and your offspring can have that genetic load. But if the mutations are big enough to stop reproduction, then those mutations can be neutral to reproduction, but yet not neutral to total functionality, because they can still have kids. Do you object to that? And if so, why?
Well, yeah, but the textbook definition of fitness is the ability to reproduce like that.
But it is. Go ahead, finish your sentence.
Well, no, that's all. That's really
okay. I would argue it's circular, because let's take the example of breathing. Paul Price uses this example. I think it's a good example. Okay. So if every single generation let's say every single generation your breathing is just a little bit worse. Okay. So that there's a decrease in the ability to respirate in a healthy manner by 5%. And so you have kids, and your kids have just a slightly decreased ability to breathe in a healthy manner. Well, it's not going to stop them from having kids. They can still have, most likely, the same amount of kids that their parents had.
right.
So in terms of reproductive fitness, sure, it's neutral. It's okay. It's all good. But in terms of total functionality, it's not so good, because that decreased ability to breathe is present. And then they're going to have kids, and then those kids are going to have a slightly worse time at breathing. And then eventually it does reach a point like a time bomb. Think about it. You have a bomb, right? And there's a timer of, let's say, 2 minutes. Well, there's not really any harmful effects other than anxiety and fear as the 2 minutes is counting down to 0, right? Even when it's at 10 seconds left, it's just ticking away. There's no explosion. But once it hits 0, boom, the bomb goes off, and there's some serious problems.
But
and
here's
that's how
another
it is with
analogy.
genetic entropy. Go ahead.
If I can remember the analogy. My short-term memory is very bad. Let's say you, okay, again, I'm going back to not all mutations are the same in all individuals. So let's say some of the population gets to the point where they can no longer breathe. Well, then the blue wire on that bomb is going to be cut, because those individuals are going to die, and that's the end of that saga.
Okay. But this goes back to the same problem. No, I appreciate it. Now, I will say Dr. Rob Carter, he did respond here to this idea of fitness variation. He's responding to Dan. He wraps up his criticism of genetic entropy with a whopper. I cannot see how he drew the conclusion that there are no differences in relative fitness from one person to the next, and that there are no selectable differences among the people in the model population. Such things were built into Mendel from the very beginning. In fact, this was the whole point of the problem. The net effect of so many mutations accumulating in a human-like population is that most individuals share a similar genetic load, but selection still happens, and it still targets those with the highest load. So I'm going to interpret this in a way that I believe is correct. Every single human being on the planet has accumulated mutations.
Sure.
We're all multiply mutant, but there is a variation in the kinds of mutations that a person has. Okay. But selection only ever sees those with the highest loads. Okay. That's what it targets. Selection targets those with the worst mutations. So it can remove those with the worst mutations. It may be able to amplify the best beneficial mutations. But those nearly neutral mutations still make the population as a whole, even in light of the variation in fitness or the variation in the kind of mutations that have accumulated, multiply mutant. And so, sure, you might have a subgroup over here that's a little more mutant. And so they're removed from the equation. But you know what that means about the next generation? The next generation as a whole is still more mutant. And so you're most...
Go ahead. Cycle. Happens again. It's a cycle. Mutation, selection, balance keeps going like that. Population, you know?
But it doesn't, because let's say you have a room of 100 people. Everybody's mutant. There's fitness variation, and there's a variation in the kind of negative mutations that have accumulated. Okay. So let's say you remove 50% of the worst. So you remove 50 people within that room of 100 people, the 50 worst mutants. Okay, they're gone. Now you're left with 50 people. But the point is, those 50 people are still more mutant than the generation before it, even though selection removed your 50 worst mutants. And so again, yeah, the problem can be slowed like this. I agree with you there, but it can't be stopped, because eventually that population of human beings, after so many generations, it's going to be like that bomb where it's going to hit zero, and the population may not be extinct at that time, but it's going to be so genetically degenerate that there's no going forward from there. Okay, go ahead. We'll speak to that a bit.
Okay, let's say a population of 100 has mutations. 50 of them have really bad ones, let's say. Those die out. The population re-expands to 100. The ones with, say, 25 of them have really a bad mutation load. Those die out. Population expands again. 25, 50 more die out. It just keeps going like this. I don't see where it would ever stop. Where's the wall, and how do we predict where it is?
Well, then you go back to this issue of the evolutionary equilibrium point, because you're arguing eventually with this, there's going to be an equilibrium, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, then it's the same thing, where you now have the nearly neutral mutation rate equaling the fixation rate. And so you're going to have, let's say the mutation rate is 10. Well, that's 10 slightly deleterious mutations reaching fixation. So now your problem has gone from a problem to a really, really big problem, because now, according to evolutionary timescale, you have those deleterious mutations not just spreading throughout the population, but many of them now becoming stuck in place. That's irreversible damage. Let me ask you this question. Those mutations that actually reach fixation, the slightly deleterious ones, they reach fixation where everybody in the population has them. How do you compensate for those? How do you get rid of those?
You don't have to get rid of them. You just have compensatory mutations, if necessary. I mean, the nearly neutral deleterious mutations really aren't, in small amounts especially, aren't even going to do anything.
Well, they will do something. Again, it's like rust on a car. It's like a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. This is just intuitive. You know,
Well,
as you introduce spelling mistakes in a book, over time, that book's not going to get better. It's not going to be more readable. Or a car that is experiencing rust molecules over time, it's not going to get it. It's just intuitive. It's just basic. As mutations accumulate, especially the fact that population geneticists agree that the majority of mutations are slightly deleterious, populations are going to get worse in the same way that cars get worse, books get worse. Things just degenerate over time. Go ahead, Jackson.
all right. If these mutations were so damaging, let's say there have been in your model 100 generations of humans since Noah and his family. Would you say that's about right? Maybe something like that.
Yeah, well, it's been 4,500 years since the flood, so a couple hundred generations.
Okay, a couple hundred, whatever. I'm just for the benefit of
the
for the sake of argument, because lifespans have been longer in the past. Whatever. At what point do you know what? I lost my train of thought just like that. What were you saying? Repeat your last statement.
The very slightly deleterious mutations that through random drift are becoming fixed in a population, leading to irreversible genetic damage. But I compared it to individual rust molecules on a car, single spelling mistakes in a book the size of an encyclopedia.
Okay, I remember now. Why in that 100 years of 100 generations? Why is it if these mutations are so negative to us already? Why is it already not influenced our ability to reproduce, even in that time span?
Well, I would argue that we do see its effects because there are thousands of new genetic related diseases that enter the genetic database every single year. Dr. John Sanford's lecture at the National Institute for Health, which is not a young earth creationist organization. I know you watched that a couple times. Yeah. He talks about near the end, and nobody objects to it in the Q&A. He points out that cancer rates are on the rise, 1 in 3, immunological diseases, asthma, autism, autoimmune diseases are skyrocketing. He points out that a lot of this could be environment, but most of it is most likely due to mutation accumulation. And so I do believe we are seeing the effects of genomic decay after only a couple hundred generations. So imagine 2,000 generations or 20,000 generations like the evolutionary model would propose and hold to. Then it's going to be a real significant problem.
Right, but you would expect more deleterious genetic diseases to show up as the population grows. It's just kind of intuitive in itself. Like 8 billion
and as mutations accumulate.
Right, but the mean effect of deleterious mutations in a larger population it decreases also. But just because there's genetic diseases doesn't mean everyone's going to die or everyone's going to be influenced negatively by mutation.
Well, it's not that everybody's going to die. It's just that every generation is slightly more mutant than the next, and that will be the trend. And so
sure,
we're not.
It only matters if you get one that causes cancer or one that causes something severe like that. That's the only time it really matters.
But most mutations just don't really have enough of an effect anyways to stop reproduction until it gets to that point where the genetic load is so high that now we're at a point where reproduction is affected negatively. But we're not at that point. And the fact that we're not at that point means that humans are young and not old, because this reality puts shelf lives on genomes. And so if we cannot persist for millions of years into the future, we certainly could not have persisted from millions of years into the past, would be my ultimate argument.
Well, I think a lot of the factors he was talking about, in fact, all of them have environmental contributions as well, like increase in tobacco and alcohol use, decreasing quality in diet. Things like this can all contribute to basically all of what he was saying.
There's environmental, decay for sure.
Mm.
There's epigenetic degeneration, genomic degeneration. And so I would like to make this illustration, which I think will help greatly in understanding this problem as to why every generation's worse off. Another example, rather than the breathing, would be, let's say every generation, okay, the offspring, their lifespan decreases by only a year. And so let's say the parents live to 70, and then the kids 69, and then their kids 68, 67, so on and so forth. Well, in terms of total functionality, fitness is going down because total functionality is going down. Because now, rather than being able to live to 70, the kids can only live to 69, and then their kids can only live to 68. And eventually it'll be 50 and 40 and 30. And so the point is, for a while, reproduction, okay, if you want to look to just reproductive success, which I believe is a very narrow way of defining fitness, as you can see here on this slide, things will be stable. Because whether you're able to live to 60 or 70 or 65 or 68, you're still going to be able to have a lot of kids. But eventually, age is going to decrease after so many generations to the point where now reproductive success will be affected negatively. Go ahead.
Right, but that's we're not seeing that anywhere. The human lifespan is only increasing.
No,
as far as we can tell. Overall, yeah.
No, the average human lifespan is increasing because of medical intervention and drugs and therapy and medicine. But
there should be nothing that could pull it back if we're so mutated, right? I mean,
well, human intervention is increasing the average lifespan, but your maximum lifespan, the amount that somebody can actually live to, that's not increasing. I'd argue that's decreasing, especially if you start from the Bible. But yeah, your average lifespan's increasing just because of medical intervention.
All right. Well, didn't the lady who lived to 120 smoke cigarettes and like drink Dr. Pepper all the time?
Well, she must have had great genetics. So as we wrap things up, because I really want to get into junk DNA and functionality, but I think we should save that for an entire show, maybe the next one, since we're at an hour and a half, because I would argue that if the vast majority of the genome is functional, let's say 80% functional, then almost nothing that you're talking about in terms of compensatory mutations, in terms of back mutations, none of it's going to matter. Because once you have a mutation rate of 80 slightly deleterious mutations per person per generation, then it's just too much. Genetic degeneration is inevitable. You're going to need a genome of, 10% functionality. So I think an entire discussion on that issue is what we should focus on next in a separate discussion. What do you think?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so I think we covered a lot of ground here.
Mm-hmm.
So Jackson, this has been, as always, a lot of fun. Love having these discussions with you. We still have great audience even during this late night hangout.
Oh, yeah, it is late. I didn't realize it was midnight already.
So Jackson, did you have any final thoughts, final points that you wanted to make before we wrap it up for the night?
Not really. I think we covered a good amount here, and I'm going to go back and outside with the telescope, take some pictures of Jupiter. So that's what I'm doing. You're
going to go from genetics to some astronomy.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. You're keeping yourself well-rounded.
Yep.
Let me ask you this question as we get ourselves ready for a follow-up discussion. How much of the genome, both non-coding and coding, would you say is functional?
Well, I think the only really thing that matters is the coding portions, as far as that's what we're talking about there.
Well, no, because if the majority of your non-coding regions, only 2% of the genome codes for proteins.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it, the other 98%, what's it doing? Well, I would argue that it's doing a lot. There's a lot of activity there. It's not just regulating the protein coding parts of the genome, but it's doing a lot of other important functions. And so if that's the case, and mutations accumulate in those regions of the genome, then that's only going to make the genetic degeneration problem even worse, because now those areas are not neutral junk, and now those areas are not able to absorb the deleterious effects. Does that make sense?
One last point then.
Yeah.
It does seem the portions of the genome that are more active have more selection pressure on them.
Right.
And they're purifying selection on that area. So I think that's...
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Take a car, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Your engine is a lot more important than a lot of other things in the car, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the inside of your car, your glove compartment or your mirrors or whatever. It's all important. It still has a function, but you can get rid of those, or you can ruin your interior seating, whatever, name it. There's so many parts to a car that don't really affect the ability of the car to function, to propel you from one place to another. But if you experienced a mutation where your engine jumped into the back seat of your car, you're going to die. Your car is going to die, because your engine's a lot more important than your windshield wipers. But your windshield wipers are still important, but you could go and tear them off and the car can still function. And so a lot of your areas of the genome, they're more functional than other parts. Like a gene involved in the heart or lungs or kidney function or brain development, those genes are going to be under stronger purifying selection than regions of the genome involved in acting as a mutational buffer or acting in the immune system. Because you have a lot of genes that are involved in cell stress responses in the immune system. And so that means you have a lot of backup genes. And so one gene can be hit with a mutation, it can be destroyed, but then you got many others acting as backup. Okay. So my whole point is, and I think you would agree because you're nodding, many parts of the genome are under stronger purifying selection than other parts, because some parts of the genome are detrimental to survival and existence.
Well, I was reading that 95% of the genome is under some form of selection pressure.
Yeah.
And I'll have to find the paper that said that, but yeah, 95%.
Okay, well, I think a follow-up discussion. What we'll do for the follow-up discussion is we'll start it a little earlier. You and I will chat about genetic entropy. We'll get into a good discussion on genomic function, and then we'll open up the mic for people to join. So we'll kind of make it a longer show. What do you think?
Yeah, sounds fun.
Okay. Well, great discussion, Jackson. I'll go back and watch it, re-listen to everything we discussed. We can recap a few things in the next discussion, since this was more so impromptu, and then we'll move into genome functionality. So Jackson, always a pleasure. Always a great professional discussion with you. And so I'm going to let you get back to your telescoping, and we'll chat soon, my man.
All right.
Okay. Bye.